All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the Sustainable Economies Law Center's Do-It-Yourself Policymaking for More Resilient Communities webinar. My name is Yassi Eskandari. I am the City Policies Director at the Sustainable Economies Law Center.
I'm Janelle Orsi. I'm the co-founder of the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and we're doing this webinar today just because we've been involved in a lot of policy making in the last couple of years, and now we realize there's a lot more left to do, and we're hoping to engage partners across the country to do policy making as well. So Christina and Neil, do you want to come introduce yourselves?
Hi everybody, I'm Neil Thapar. I'm a staff attorney at Sustainable Economies Law Center. I've been here for a little bit over a year and dove right into policymaking related to creating a more resilient food system. And so I'm excited to share what I've learned with all of you today.
Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina. I manage a lot of our state level policy campaigns and occasionally advise people in other states or local government levels about some advocacy too. And I'll be talking a lot about strategy towards the end of the call today.
I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Shareable and Transition US, for their support.
Okay, so more about why we're doing this and why I'm so excited to empower policymakers around the country. There's our website, by the way. You can see one of our news items recently was just the bills that we passed in California last year, which is 3 of them, most of which are designed to lower barriers to community scale economic activities. And so we did that. We're based in California, and although we're a national organization, it's hard for us to do everything everywhere, and we realize there are so many laws that need to be changed that we should start empowering people everywhere. So our goal is to provide support to people around the country who are doing this work, and our hope is over the next few years to grow our capacity to provide support to citizen policymakers. But in thinking about how many laws there are to change, one thing I realized is, all right, if we're really going to be able to change all of these laws, maybe we need to encourage everybody to kind of set the goal of changing just one law. So if you have a to-do list, maybe just add it to your to-do list to just change one law. And if you're a particularly ambitious person, or if you get really into changing laws, maybe you could try changing one of each: a city law, a state law, federal law, a regulation, because once you do all of these things, it'll be very empowering. And then you can get back to life as usual. So add that to your to-do list. But here are some reasons why I think everybody should consider themselves to be a citizen policymaker. And one is just everything that's happening in the world right now has pushed us to kind of be reactive. We tend to get involved in policy when we are opposing legislation that we don't like, or when we want to pass legislation to abolish things that we don't like. It's very reactive. And we really need to switch gears to focus on proactive policy making. So policies that grease the wheels of the next economy, the various things that are going to come and replace the current economy, so worker cooperatives, eco-villages, local currencies, time banks, and so on. We need to pass a lot of policies to lower barriers and create incentives for those. And then the second reason everybody should get involved is that, our economy and the law are so intertwined. In fact, the law really creates the fabric of our economy and vice versa. And as a result of that, if we're creating a whole new economy, we're going to run up against a lot of legal barriers because our legal system is just not designed for things like very small scale production, cottage scale production, and so on. And so there's a lot of legal gray areas that come up. So I like to break it down like this, that in our personal realm, there are a lot of things we do, like have a car. In the realm of commercial activity, there are things like operating car rental companies, which are regulated, and there's a lot of laws that apply to car rental companies to make sure cars are safe and so on. But if a bunch of neighbors get together to form a car sharing club, that's actually a legal gray area. Are they a car rental company? Are they just a few people sharing a car? And that's a massive gray area that the next economy is likely to exist in a lot of the time. So there's almost a spectrum of economic activity, much of which the legal system is still confused about. Just a few more examples. Growing food in a backyard is very different from being a farmer, but when people try to sell food they grow in their backyard, it brings up a lot of legal barriers. So our organization's been working on those legal issues quite a bit, actually. People who go grocery shopping don't have as many laws to comply with as people who run a grocery store. But if people get together to form a small grocery cooperative or a buying club, at what point do they become their own grocery store as opposed to just people doing grocery shopping together? And what ends up happening is there could be a lot of legal hoops to jump through. If they turn out to be a grocery store, there's food and ag laws, zoning laws, health and safety laws, securities laws, and these are all good laws, but they're just very expensive to get through, and generally only large businesses can do so. So the Sustainable Economies Law Center does a lot of work to lower those barriers, bring those legal hoops back down to earth, and as you can see, we have a lot of fun doing it. But there are a lot of laws, and we need to change a lot of them, and potentially millions of them. Just the seed sharing laws that we've been working on, those alone, we managed to change 2 laws this year in Nebraska and Minnesota to legalize seed libraries, and Neil's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But that leaves 48 other states where we need to pass these laws, so that's where we hope to engage everybody listening. Reason number 4. In theory, we have a democracy in this country, but it's only going to be a democracy if we really take advantage of it. And I was reminded recently of what privilege we have to be able to step up and try to influence laws, because in many countries, people don't have these opportunities, or they are persecuted when they try to change things. And we still have a lot of freedom in this country to do things, and democracy means people getting engaged not only in voting, but also in getting more deeply involved in shaping their laws. But it's hard to do because the legal system kind of looks like this. It kind of looks like a giant tower that nobody can penetrate. And it's not just legislation, it's the entire realm of the law. It's lawyers and how much they cost, it's law schools and courts and everything that has become very intimidating to the average person about the law. And a lot of that is because law has become big business. And lawyers have an interest, in fact, in keeping it big business and in keeping it somewhat impenetrable to the average person, because it keeps lawyers in business, making a lot of money doing their work. So the one goal is to just help a lot more people get into that tower in a way and sort of break in and start doing this work. Average people, not just lawyers or highly trained individuals, but everyday people. Although I think the ultimate goal will eventually be to just bring the entire legal system back down to earth, so it's more like a commons where basically everybody can play. I use a playground as a metaphor here. But it should be something where everybody can feel welcome and feel like they can come in and play and change things and create the world they want to live in. So another reason everybody should become a policymaker is that every bill kind of needs a babysitter, and we found this out sometimes the hard way. It's not enough to just come up with a really great policy idea and introduce it. A lot of crazy things can happen while the bill is running through the legislature, because people could add riders. I'm getting a message that I have decreased audio quality, but I'm still broadcasting, right? Still good? Okay. Anyways, one time we had a bill completely stripped down at the very end of the legislative season, and it was replaced by an entirely different bill, so it was gutted, and we had to start completely from scratch the next year. So, but if there are people who are really keeping an eye on a bill and walking it through the whole process, crazy things are a little less likely to happen, and we can keep stakeholders informed of what's going on and react to changes very quickly. So lawmaking is very empowering, and I found this quote from an old legal ethics essay that legislation is almost resembles the work of the deity, whatever deity that might be for you. That's a pretty powerful thing, and it really is a powerful thing if you think about how much it can change the fabric of our lives. A few years ago, we passed a law that made it legal to sell food that you make at home in California, and within the first year, there were 2,000 new food businesses, cottage food businesses in California. And so little things, like little laws that we change, can make a big deal in people's lives. Another good reason to become policymakers, you'll make a lot of new friends. And the reason for that is it's very hard to do this on your own. Inevitably, you're going to team up with other people, build coalitions. Even 2 people can get together and change a law, even 1 person, but there are a lot of different skills needed. Generally, it's good to have somebody who's a bit of a technocrat and good at reading and writing fine legal details, and it's good to have somebody who's an extroverted person who likes to go and talk to stakeholders and legislators. And if you're both of those people at once, then you're the whole package, and that's great. But overall, building teams to pass new laws is a great way to do it. Also, legislators, as it turns out, want our bill ideas. And it took me a while to realize this, but a lot of legislators are just average people who get into office eventually and still don't necessarily know all of the ways that they want to make change when they're there. And so when somebody comes and says, oh, I have an idea for a bill, a lot of times legislators are really grateful. And so just know that you'll be doing them a favor if you're bringing bill ideas. And by the way, that is how a lot of laws get changed. Is one of the very first steps in officially starting the process is finding a legislator who will champion your bill and introduce it. It's usually called a sponsor or an author. Number 10. It turns out that inexperienced people have a very competitive edge when it comes to making laws. I mean, there's a lot that experience will teach you that is good, but also if you're an everyday person, you can speak from the experience of just being a person who needs a law to change or needs a law to be introduced. And you'll walk into legislators' offices, probably not looking like a lobbyist, definitely not talking like a lobbyist, and that is kind of a breath of fresh air for legislators. And, you know, maybe you'll put on a suit every now and then, or maybe not. But we started changing laws really before we had any experience doing it, and found that it just wasn't as hard as we thought it would be. And in fact, we had a good excuse to ask a lot of questions. And when you ask legislative staff, hey, I'm new here, can you help me? It's also a good opportunity to build rapport with staff. So, okay, so you decided you're going to become a lobbyist hobbyist or hobbyist lobbyist, whatever the case may be, and start passing laws in your spare time. Here's a good place to start. I think there are a lot of approaches to changing laws. There's creating new programs, there's reforming existing laws, there's creating legal incentives and tax incentives, but there's also just lowering legal barriers to things we want to do. And that is a lot of the lawmaking we need to do in the new economy, is lowering barriers. And I kind of think of lowering barriers as a gateway drug to becoming a citizen policymaker for 3 reasons. First of all is you tend to get bipartisan support because, for example, when we passed the cottage food law in California to lower barriers and open doors to home-based food businesses, Republicans liked it because it was a kind of a deregulation, and people on the left liked it because it was economic empowerment and creating economic opportunity and creating jobs. And so we got a lot of support. And many of the bills where we're lowering barriers get that kind of bipartisan support. Also, lowering legal barriers tends to not cost the government money. When you're creating a new program that's going to require going through what's called an appropriations committee, requiring the government to actually allocate money toward a program, it's a lot harder to get that law passed. But in fact, if you're lowering barriers, you might even be saving the government money on enforcement. And yeah, so it's a little easier. And also writing the bill might even be easier because sometimes you're starting with the existing statutory language and you are amending it from there rather than writing a whole new section of the code from scratch. So Neil's going to come over and tell us a little bit about what happened with seed libraries, just to give an example really of how easy it was to jump in and start changing a few laws after we found out that there were a lot of unreasonable legal barriers to seed libraries. So.
Thanks, Janelle. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so speaking of somebody who didn't have that much experience, even though I'm a lawyer in the policymaking realm, it was a really great kind of like gateway to policymaking for me as well, to work on our Safe Seed Sharing campaign. And so just a little background, seed libraries are places where people can go and get access to free seeds that are distributed within a community. And it provides access to food for people by way of gardening, educates people on seed saving, builds a network of seed savers, and enhances local adaptation of seeds, which is going to be really important to the future of our food system. So it does a lot of great things. Unfortunately, last year we found out that seed libraries were being regulated under state seed laws, which I didn't know actually existed until reading about this. And when we did a little bit of research at SELC, we found out that these state seed laws were created to regulate commercial seed sales, and they were being applied to seed libraries where people were freely exchanging seeds and no money was being transferred. So we found that these laws were being interpreted in a way to be a barrier to the free sharing of seeds through seed libraries, which is often the case. A lot of times laws are passed and they're intended for one purpose or a few purposes, and then they're kind of navigated to a different direction and they don't really apply. And so that's often the times a legal barrier is created, is when a law is misapplied. And so after we read the law, we found that really just a simple amendment to one section of the law that exempts certain activities from the state seed law would clear up the miscommunication and the misapplication of the law. And so that's really what we did in drafting the legislation. It turned out that it was just one line adding an exemption for non-commercial seed sharing that would clarify the relationship between the state seed law and seed libraries. And that's really what it was. It was just one sentence. And it ended up having a really big impact because there's over 350 seed libraries across the country. And like Janelle showed, there's now 2 states where at least those seed libraries have a clear understanding of their roles and their rights to share seeds with each other. And there's a whole lot more across the country that need the same protection. So that's an example of removing a legal barrier. And it's as easy as planting a seed.
Thanks, Neil. And I have a feeling that probably everyone on the webinar could think of something that they've been involved in. Maybe you're trying to build a co-housing community or start a worker cooperative or something, and you hit against a legal barrier. And that barrier might just be that in order to comply with the law, you have to pay a lot of fees, you have to deal with a lot of paperwork. But even if what you want to do is not illegal, there's still a lot of barriers that might seem unreasonable. And so that's an opportunity for you to think, hey, maybe we should reduce this barrier or remove this barrier. And when you're lowering barriers, really, strategy for doing it really depends on what is the underlying purpose of the law to begin with. Is it to protect consumers, which is sort of potentially the underlying idea behind the seed laws? And so, we thought, well, we can reduce barriers to seed libraries because overall the risk to somebody getting, the wrong kind of seed, it's not a huge risk for society to take to let people share seeds with each other. And so, but where you draw the line and say how much seed sharing is enough or too much, again, just think about the purpose of the law. And this is just a list of some of the kinds of purposes for which we create laws. And often what you're going to find is you're going to create a definition of something. Like a seed library is a nonprofit or a cooperative where people donate seeds and receive donations of seeds. And, you create that definition in the law that kind of draws a line somewhere here in this spectrum and says, this activity is not regulated and this activity is, or there's sort of an intermediate realm of regulation for this activity and so on. But removing barriers, as I said, is not the only work that we need to do. A lot of what we want to do in the new economy, even if there aren't legal barriers, there are a lot of, we're just not operating on an even playing field. And in fact, a lot of the things we want to create, it feels like pushing a very heavy rock up a hill. And it's just that a lot of things in society are not designed to help us do this. And it's not just laws, but it's, opportunities to access financing, opportunities to learn about cooperatives or other things. And so we've introduced a law in Oakland to create incentives and programs to support cooperative development. Did you want to talk about it at all, Yassi? Okay, step on up. So this is just, Yassi's going to give an example of what's happening in Oakland as far as building incentives for new economy.
Yeah, so right now in Oakland, we're working on our worker cooperative ordinance. And basically, it's a policy to support the development of new cooperatives and conversion of existing businesses to worker cooperatives. And the reason we're doing this is because we believe that worker cooperatives create stable, dignified, locally based jobs, and they're an important part of more resilient and just economies. So we've been working with local elected officials. We've been working with individuals and actual cooperatives and other nonprofits that are working with cooperatives to develop this policy. And actually, an interesting thing about the strategy, I think, is that we started with our staff attorney, Sarah Stevens, creating the actual draft. Then we shopped it around to all of these people and stakeholders and dozens of organizations to give their feedback, and we've been implementing that feedback. And then we've been going to to our local policymakers and both asking for their feedback, but also trying to get them to support it and to find someone to actually introduce it so that we can begin the advocacy process. It's been really interesting, and the actual ordinance itself would create various incentives for worker cooperative development and support systems, including ensuring that our local small business development services are catered to worker cooperatives as well as other small businesses, that we create a revolving loan fund to create access to finance for our worker cooperatives, to provide grants to organizations that are incubating cooperatives and supporting cooperatives like the Sustainable Economies Law Center, for example, and also creating markets for worker cooperatives and ensuring that the city preferentially contracts with and purchases from worker co-ops. So it's an exciting process, and it's underway, and we're hoping that it'll move forward within the next year or so.
Okay, thanks, Yassi. Just a final word. Probably a lot of people will also be thinking, where do I start? Where do I get some policy ideas? If you don't already have something you're working on and you're not already thinking of a particular project, Sustainable Economies Law Center is trying to build a whole menu or a library of policies that we hope that other people around the country will pick up and start introducing in their cities and their states. And so if you go to the selc.org/policies, we're starting to build the menu there. Right now we only have 3 items, but we're going to build it out in the next few months. And so you'll find lots of articles there and resources and a few other places aside from the Sustainable Economies Law Center, where we look to for policy ideas. State Innovation Exchange creates a library of policy ideas. So does the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. There's a policy database at growingfoodconnections.org, and there's also this one at Johns Hopkins with a really long URL. So I just thought I'd show it to you. If you pull up the list of policy ideas and resources, there are 724 results. So go ahead and take a look around there. That'll help you build your policy agenda. But also, if you just want to get people together and have conversations about what is it that you're doing in your community and what are some policies we should start introducing, make it festive and fun like a party. This is an example of conversations we've had, events that we've had. You could also look at some of the laws that Sustainable Economies Law Center has already passed, like the cottage food law in California, and you can note there's definitely some states that don't even have laws like that yet. And even in the states that do, there's definitely room for improvement. So you could also just think about everything within that gray area that I mentioned, this middle column of activities that don't quite fit into the regulatory scheme yet, and think about how you want to help enable that. So I'm going to pass it over to Neil now, who's going to give us a little Law 101, some encouragement about being civically engaged, and so on.
Great. Yeah, so like what Janelle was saying, laws do more than just restrict what we can do. And a lot of times that's when we think about policymaking in our everyday life, is about seeing something that we think might not or should not happen. But actually, laws can also kind of expand the universe of things that we can or that we should do. And there are a lot of them being proposed all the time. And so it's really important for all of us to be engaged and voice our support and sometimes our opposition to laws that we want to see or that we don't want to see move forward. And it's, when we think about kind of being civically engaged in California, at least, a state that people might associate with having an engaged citizenry, we only had, I think, 40% of our population vote in the last general election. So less than half of the people actually came out to vote. And that was on a day that a lot of people are familiar with. You go out and you vote on a Tuesday. But laws are being passed all the time. And so imagine just how much more impact we could all have if we actually got on the phone or wrote a letter or just spent 10 minutes every week passing laws or helping pass laws that we want to see. So this is a little sort of reminder and tip for how to spend 10 minutes a week to help pass good laws. And so really it's just a phone call or a letter or an email away. And a lot of us don't, get the opportunity to write letters anymore because of email. So this is an opportunity, if you want to work on your penmanship, to actually write a letter, a handwritten letter to your legislator or to a city councilor. And so some ways that you can do this is to set a weekly reminder, maybe to sign any petitions that have come into your email inbox, or if you have organizations that you receive emails from and they send updates every now and again, to just sort of maybe bookmark those and go into your into that folder one time per week and spend 10 minutes either signing or writing a letter. And maybe if you are going to spend more time calling because you like to do that, then put your local, state, or even federal representatives' phone numbers on speed dial so that you don't have to look them up every time. If you just come across something, someone talks to you in conversation and mentions some bill, or if you see an email and you just want to make a quick call, just it's one click away and you can call them. So that's 10 minutes a week, and we'll have a lot better laws on the books in the near future. And so we're going to sort of transition to more about, okay, well, how do you actually design and write a law, and what are some of the strategies that you're going to want to use to be successful? And so it helps to learn a little bit about the way the legal system is set up and about how laws operate, so you kind of know where to direct your energy. And it's not, a lot of people think about law as being kind of hard to understand, or lots of long papers and pages, and sometimes it's like that, and in aggregate it looks like that, but actually to just write a law, it's not necessarily the most complicated thing, and it just requires using plain language a lot of the time to get your point across. And there's a lot of people who can help along the way to turn it into the sort of thing that we think of when we think of laws, which is not as easily understandable. So don't be discouraged. There's a lot of help. So let's talk a little bit about the law itself and a few sort of kind of archaic doctrines that exist that influence how our legal system is set up today, and I think we'll give good context. So there's a couple of doctrines that exist that come out of our Constitution at the federal level, and case law after that, and one of them is preemption, which is this idea that there's a hierarchy between the different laws that exist in our system. So there's federal law, state law, and local law. And preemption means that when there's any sort of law at the federal level that regulates a certain activity or a certain area, and if there's conflicting law at the state or local level, then the federal law will trump. And so that is the law that applies. And same happens at the state versus local level. So it's kind of just three different tiers of law. And if there's any sort of conflict between the three, the one that's higher will prevail. And that relates to the second piece, which is federalism, which is this idea that any law that, any authority that isn't expressly given to the federal government is reserved to the states. And so anything that's not in the Constitution that says the federal government has authority to do this, like create, operate the postal service. I think that's one thing that the federal government has jurisdiction over. But anything that's not listed there, the state has control over. So when you're thinking of the different policy ideas and areas of your life that you want to remove some barriers to, think about whether or not it's something that the federal government has authority over, or maybe your state or local government. And what are the different laws, and where do they exist, and what do they look like? And so they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So at each of those levels, federal, state, and local, there are kind of two varieties or flavors of laws or rules that are binding that might need to be changed. So the first are just regular old laws. They're also called statutes sometimes. If you're looking around on the internet, you might see them referred to as statutes. And these are generally proposed and passed by a legislative body of elected officials. So these are our state and local reps, and our state legislatures and our city councils. So the little asterisk there is just to note that there are also in some states the initiative and referendum process, which is an older version of kind of how we engaged in our democracy. It's called direct democracy, and I think 24 states in the US have the initiative process, and it's a way for citizens to get together and propose a law themselves and have it sent straight to the ballot for all the voting citizens of the state to decide on. And a referendum is similar in that it usually will either be a vote to approve or repeal a certain law that the legislature passed themselves. So a way to get more direct relationship to the actual law that's being passed. So those are laws or statutes. And there's a second sort of flavor, which are called regulations or rules. Sometimes you'll see it. And these are also binding, so they have the same effect as a law does, but they're usually created by not a body of elected officials necessarily, but by an executive body or an agency. So like the Department of Agriculture, or the Department of Highways and Transportation. So these agencies that are given power to regulate certain areas of our lives, they will sometimes have also the authority to create rules and regulations that are based on a law. So sometimes a law will be sort of a skeleton and say, you know, these are the areas where we want some regulation, and they'll tell the agency, Department of Agriculture, you guys write the rules because you guys have expertise in this area. And so there's laws and there's regulations. And the last slide here, which kind of talks about which law applies, which will help you decide, you know, where to direct your advocacy efforts. And so this is a really general outline, and it varies obviously by state. And also you'll see that some of these have the same color, and that's just to show that there's oftentimes overlapping laws in both federal and state, and sometimes state and local jurisdictions. And so that's where this idea of preemption comes into play, to know sort of where specifically and where's the most relevant area of law. Is it at the state level or at the federal level when you're looking at financing? So at Sustainable Economies Law Center, we're approaching a particular area of securities law at the state level and not at the federal level. Although, you know, it might be applicable at the federal level as well. We're focusing on state level legislation for now. So that should help in sort of deciding where you want to direct your advocacy efforts. So after that, once you know where you're going to target your advocacy efforts and kind of what level you want to write your law for, there's the process of actually finding out and writing the text of the law, or at least the proposed text of the law. So there's a few tips here that might help. The first is to just get together and start reading the laws in the area that you're interested in. So if you're interested in, let's say, food laws, you're going to start to read parts of the code in your state or your local jurisdiction that regulate food. And you can do this by yourself with the internet, or you can organize people together, the people who you're going to need and who are going to be your new friends when you're making these laws, to do a hackathon, or what we call research explosion days, where we all get together at our local law library and just dive into the different areas of law that we're interested in for that day. A lot of them are online. A lot of these laws are available online and for free. You can just Google if it's at the state level, you can just Google the state and legislature, and they usually have a link to all the laws in that state. And similarly for your local city, if it's a city law that you're interested in changing. Another tip is to find a similar or analogous law. And this oftentimes helps because it gives you an idea of kind of the outline or structure of a law that you might want to pass that already exists. Especially if what you're trying to change affects different areas. This helps in reducing the chance that there's some duplicative or kind of redundant requirements in what you're proposing and what might already exist. And then the last is just try writing the law yourself. You don't need to be a lawyer to write the outline of the law. You can give kind of words to what it is that you want to change, and that helps as you kind of have a starting point to talk with an author or a champion of the legislation that'll actually go through the process. You don't have to do this. You can come to a legislator with an idea, and then they can pass it on to people who work at the legislature, whose job it is to write new legislation. But it's always good to have kind of a skeleton outline, at least to come to a conversation with, and also to have someone on your team who can review the draft that maybe the people at the legislature write, just to make sure that the language fits with what your intent is and make sure that it's addressing the change that you want to make. Hey, Yassi, what's up in Oakland?
What's up in Oakland? Hey guys. Okay, so Neil just gave a great rundown of how you can create a policy from scratch, and that was brilliant and set some really good foundations for us. But I'm here to also say that you don't always have to start from scratch. You can start to get involved locally and regionally very easily by figuring out what are your priorities, what are your policy priorities. Is it getting better bicycle infrastructure? Is it getting more green areas or parks in your neighborhoods, etc.? Then you can go and you can kind of scan what kinds of policy opportunities are available right now. Likely there are probably things happening in your city or region that could be opportunities for you to start to inject your policy priorities into them. So the first step could be going to your city council or regional board of supervisors or related body and figure out what's going on. And then once you identify any policy opportunities, you can start to go to public meetings, read more about the actual program or proposal, and start to submit comments either in person or in writing and start to influence it and show how the program or policy could be improved to better serve your community. Another effective strategy is to actually meet directly with the people behind the proposal, to meet with the key players that include planners, elected representatives, and also the organizations that are behind shaping and supporting those various initiatives. By meeting directly with these people, you can start to really build trust, start building a mutual respect and good relationships, and start to also negotiate and discuss how you can come to compromises on various disagreements potentially. And lastly, I can't emphasize more, I think your efforts, if you want to get involved in local and regional policy work, is to, that your best bet is to start to create a coalition of grassroots support, because people want to see diverse groups of people and also a large number of people coming out to express support for the same thing. So if you can get all sorts of groups to agree on one particular initiative, that's very telling, and people will take notice, and your efforts will be much more successful.
Now, I think it's time for Christina Oatfield, who can often be seen at the state capitol, as seen here in the middle, talking to senators and influencing legislation. And now she's going to give us her amazing strategy tips for passing laws. Pass it down there.
All right, I'm back again. Cool. So like Janelle said, I go to Sacramento a lot, and I sometimes consult groups in other areas around policymaking and working with regulators. And I just want to start out with one, tip number one is based on a common misperception that 501c3 nonprofit organizations cannot lobby, when in fact they can indeed lobby. There are some restrictions, of course, on their lobbying efforts, but I've lost track of how many times someone has said to me, oh, we'd love to support this campaign or legislation, but we can't because we're a 501c3. So just know that 501c3s can indeed lobby, but there are certain limits. So a 501c3 may not be able to spend more than about 20% of its resources in a given year influencing legislation. Also note that 501c3s cannot endorse candidates, so it doesn't matter who your personal favorite candidate for president is right now. The 501c3 that you may be affiliated with cannot take a position, or cannot make a donation or anything like that to, to influence someone running for office, whether it's for president of the U.S. or city council. But specific pieces of legislation, 501c3s can definitely support or oppose or request amendments for and do all kinds of things like that. So don't let that stop you or someone you know from supporting good legislation. Next tip is just get lots of organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, businesses, and notable individuals to write letters of support. I think legislators are really impressed when there's kind of a diverse coalition of people and groups supporting a bill. And there are ways you can make it easy for people to do that. You can write up sort of a sample letter, and you can include like a bullet point list of talking points that people can choose to kind of write into their own words, or you can just provide a sample with, address and contact information and instructions like that. And put it somewhere on like a website or a Facebook page or somewhere where people can easily access it. Although when I'm working on a legislative campaign, I spend a lot of time doing personal outreach to different community groups, asking them to write a support letter, and sometimes kind of making sure that they understand the legislation and have all their questions answered as well. So you may want to do a lot of personalized outreach in addition to having kind of an internet presence with that material. And on the subject of writing letters, I really generally try and urge people to write paper letters and send it in the snail mail or by fax to their legislators when they're expressing a position on legislation, because legislators and their staff know that it's really easy for people to sort of like click a button and, sign their name onto an electronic petition, or, a lot of bigger advocacy organizations have this sophisticated software that make it easy for you to, send an email directly through, directly to your legislator, by clicking a couple buttons. And so they know that it doesn't take a lot of effort and that people often don't put a lot of thought into that. But when they receive a paper letter in the mail or in the fax, they know like, okay, someone actually spent more than a couple seconds like clicking on a button, to send me this. So it just speaks more powerfully. Similarly, when they get a phone call, they know it takes you a little bit more time and courage to make that phone call instead of just clicking a box to sign a petition. So that also speaks pretty loudly, making a phone call. And of course, in-person visits, when possible, are often the best way for an individual or group to express its views on legislation. Visiting your local city council member's office, contacting them and requesting an appointment. Or, if you want to meet with a state or federal legislator, they often have a district office where their constituents can meet with them. And a lot of legislators, make time on a weekly or monthly basis to meet with constituents who are not, fancy lobbyists. So when possible, we definitely recommend setting up those meetings in person. And then kind of the next most powerful thing is, paper letters and phone calls. And then, petitions and emails are, sometimes effective when there's a really huge volume of them, but generally the, electronic petitions and emails are kind of not how we recommend people contact their legislators for our campaigns. And on that note, I recommend using some caution when it comes to online petitions. Online petitions can be really great for kind of just like spreading the word. A lot of people like to kind of forward them or share them on social media, so just kind of spreading the word, getting people involved. And the key thing that they're good for is collecting the contact information of people who support your cause. But unless there's a, really extremely large number of people who have signed the petition, lawmakers don't pay a lot of attention to that. They pay more attention when, their office is receiving personalized like letters and phone calls and things like that. So that's really kind of what I see as the value of online petitions, is collecting supporters' contact information so that you can then follow up with them and say, hey, here's a template support letter. You should send this to, such and such legislator by this date. And kind of a few more words of caution if you are going to go with an online petition is make sure that you choose one that really works for you and that lets you actually collect supporters' contact information. We've had a lot of like really serious kind of nightmare technical difficulties with some of the online petition platforms that are out there. Some of them don't actually let you access the contact info of the people who sign the petition. You have to use the petition platform's messaging function to contact the supporters, and that often doesn't work very well. Like there are delays in sending messages out, or the messages go to people's, go into people's spam filters and things like that. So make sure that you kind of think carefully about your petition platform before you launch a petition and start asking lots of people to sign it, and make sure that you're actually going to be able to use it effectively to contact those people later. If not, you're better off, just asking people to just give you their email address and phone number so that you can contact them when there's a important time to take action. Tip number 5, tell stories about real life examples of people who could benefit from the law that you're trying to pass. Ideally, you would find, charming people who can sort of be poster children for your campaign. So an example here in this slide is Mark Stambler, who is a bread baker in Los Angeles who made this really amazing high quality bread in his home kitchen. He had actually built his own brick oven to bake the bread in, and he was selling it illegally from his home kitchen to some local shops and to customers, and it was wildly popular. And then the health department came and shut him down and caused some trouble for the other local businesses that had been selling his bread. So this was this, amazing story of a real person who could benefit from the cottage food law that we worked on that Janelle mentioned earlier. And this just really helped us get a lot of really positive attention around our campaign. Legislators love this. This whole story actually inspired Assemblymember Mike Gatto to champion the bill for us. And the media loved this, and kind of going on to the next tip, if you're effective at finding real life examples of why your bill is needed and telling stories around that, you can get the media to be a free advertising agency for your campaign, essentially. So here's a clip from the San Francisco Chronicle talking about another bill that we've been working on at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And so getting positive light shed on your bill in major media outlets can be a great way to sort of reach out to potential supporters beyond your immediate networks. So sometimes people find out about a bill because they read about it in the paper, and then they can kind of, if they're inspired, they'll often follow up and find you and, sign up for your email list and, opt in to kind of being more involved in your campaign. So use that to your benefit. And be prepared, when you're launching a campaign to work on a bill at any level of government, there's some ways that you can sort of be better prepared to talk to media reporters, from, a small blog to, a major regional newspaper. Have an easy way for them to contact you. If you have some place on the internet where, there's an email address or a phone number for someone that's responsive, who's knowledgeable about your campaign. And if you get a request to be interviewed by a reporter, make sure that you spend some time before, just getting prepared. Make sure that you know your key talking points. You should know what the 1 or 2 most important things that you want that reporter to know are. And you should practice saying that in a, concise kind of elevator pitch way multiple times. And have that list of poster children, or those real life examples of people who could benefit from the law handy. Have a list of their names and their contact info, and have them, knowledgeable about the bill and the main talking points, so that you can refer reporters to them, to feature those stories in the newspaper or the radio or wherever. And some of this can, it's good to be prepared, because some of this can happen quickly. Sometimes reporters contact us and say, hey, I'm working on a story about this. I'd like to talk about your bill. And, my deadline for finishing my story is tomorrow, or, some extremely short amount of time. So it's good to kind of get these materials and talking points prepared ahead of time and be ready to seize the opportunity when it comes up. So tip number 7, when you're drafting a bill proposal or a bill itself, and you're trying to find a legislator to support it, that's a good time to also be proactive about engaging stakeholders, including potential opponents. So you should be thinking, who's going to support this bill, who's going to oppose it, and who might just have really good feedback on it. Who deals with this issue area, who's an expert on this, or who would be affected by this, who maybe would have really good suggestions for for improving your bill. And I think when you're shopping a bill around and trying to find a legislator to back it, they're often really impressed if you can show that you kind of thought this through a little bit and have maybe even reached out to some stakeholders, because it shows them that you're serious, it shows them that you're being strategic. And, you know, they might have their own personal style for how they want to deal with like tricky opposition groups, for example, but it's good at least to start thinking about it, and work with the legislator backing your bill on how to deal specifically with any opposition that might be problematic. And then another strategy as you're sort of to think about as you're kind of crafting your bill proposal or the bill itself is to kind of have multiple versions of your bill. And this might be kind of a secret thing. You might not, you know, don't tell the reporter who interviews you about this, or, you know, don't tell your opposition about this, but, you know, you might want to start out, you know, the kind of public proposal of your bill should kind of be your ideal law. So that's, you know, on the left side of your screen, your great law, and it should include all the components that you realistically think, you know, a legislator would want to get behind and support, and all the things that you want out of the legislation within reason. And then you may want to have one or more versions that are sort of backup versions, you know, especially if your bill has a lot of different nuances. You know, maybe try and think what is the single most important or the few most important things that you'd really like to accomplish with this. And, you know, if it turns out that there's too much opposition or issues with legislators just kind of understanding your bill, you know, maybe there's a way to kind of distill it down and get something that's passable, even if it's not everything that you wanted. And depending on how complicated your bill is, you may have several different scenarios that you have, you know, secretly planned in your back pocket. But sometimes once a piece of legislation gets introduced, it starts moving through the process pretty quickly. And then there's, you know, all kinds of stakeholders that emerge from the woodwork who, you know, want to suggest amendments or want to oppose your bill. And it can just kind of eat up a lot of your time. So it's good to know before the bill is introduced and moving, you know, what is your best case scenario? What's your, you know, worst case scenario that's still better than, you know, no legislation moving forward at all? And just kind of be prepared to have to, you know, make quick decisions once the bill is moving through the process. You may not have a lot of time to think about these things then. Tip number 9, get to know your elected representatives and their staff. And don't be disappointed if you want to have meetings with legislators, but you only get to have meetings with staff. You know, at the local, like city or county government level, you're more likely to be able to interact with the, you know, city council member or county supervisor, him or herself, but especially at, you know, state and federal levels of government, you know, staff are the main point of contact, especially for citizen policymakers, but even for a lot of, you know, lobbyists and kind of professional policy wonks. You know, we spend a lot of time talking to the staff, who are often the ones kind of running the office on a day-to-day basis. And so just, you know, get to know them and, you know, start developing good relationships with them, even if you don't have a fully developed bill idea yet. You know, if you know you might want to work on something at some level of government, you know, just learn who your elected representatives are, and they often are, you know, making appearances at events that are open to the public and where you can go and just kind of learn about what their priorities are, you know, meet their staff, you know, find ways to meet them and to learn more about what their priorities are. And the final tip, which is maybe the most important of them all, is if at first you don't succeed, try again. There's a lot of legislation that takes multiple attempts in order to be successful. You know, sometimes you don't get the piece of legislation passed the first try at all. Sometimes you don't, you know, sometimes you have to accept that it's going to get watered down or changed a little bit the first time around, and you may want to go back in the future to, you know, get other components of your ideal law passed. So just don't be discouraged if it doesn't work out on the first try. This happens a lot, especially with more kind of new and innovative ideas that are really great ideas. It just sometimes takes policymakers and the general public a while to kind of, you know, grasp the idea and, you know, come to support the idea. So, you know, it takes courage to keep at it, but it can really pay off in big ways if you do, you know, if you do have some persistence and keep trying again. So thanks everyone, and I think we're moving on to Q&A now. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.